Welcome back, Schmoozers. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's podcast. I am David Cobby, and I'm excited to be back with another weekly episode where I help proud Jews promote their own personal brand. I just wanted to give a quick shout out to everyone that's already followed me on TikTok and Instagram. I greatly, greatly appreciate your continued support of the show, and I really hope that you're enjoying all the content that I'm putting out. In today's episode, you're going to hear from my favorite teacher of all time. I'm so sorry to all of my other teachers listening to this. This is not meant to offend you guys, but this is my favorite teacher of all time. No, hands down. This individual is so well-versed in history, and I guarantee you that you will learn something new today. As a junior in high school at the Alexander Muss High School in Israel, I had the pleasure of having this individual as my Israeli/Jewish history teacher and tour guide. Now she assumes the Dean of Israeli Studies at the best high school study abroad program in Israel. Please welcome to my podcast, none other than Lisa Biton. Lisa, how are we doing today?
It's great to be here, and we are so glad to have students back on campus to be having the same experience that you had. I don't want to age us, either of us, how long it's been, but that long ago.
Yes, it's definitely been a while, but we're catching up here, and it's awesome, and very excited for this episode to kind of hear new things about AMHSI, what you guys are doing, and in a very, very important time for Zionist education. So really excited to have you on here, and really appreciate you coming on the show.
Of course, we always like being in touch with alumni.
Yes. All right, so Lisa, we have a segment on here called Your Jewish Geography Profile. I have, in past episodes, tried to make it a rapid fire question kind of thing, but clearly that hasn't worked because us Jews love to schmooze. We got to talk for, we can't not talk for more than 2 minutes consecutively. So I'm going to change this up a little bit. We're not going to do a rapid fire. We're just going to go question by question. You're going to take your time to answer, but don't feel pressure to, do long-winded answers. But so basically you're just going over who you are, kind of introducing yourself. Ready for the questions?
I'm ready. I'll try to be concise.
Awesome. All right. So Lisa, where are you originally from?
I'm originally from the San Francisco Bay Area. I grew up just outside of Stanford, as close as any small town anyone will know.
Okay. And what high school did you attend?
It's called Menlo High School. It's a private school, not far from Stanford.
Okay. Was it a Jewish private high school or just general private?
No, not Jewish. My background's a little bit mixed, and I wasn't much into my Jewish identity until I hit high school, I would say. That was when I first started learning about, what it meant to me. But no, it was not important to me to do it. There weren't many Jewish high schools in the area or Jewish middle schools even, so just a private high school.
And then what college did you attend? I know you went to a few different schools, but if you could just talk a little bit about your college experience, what that was like.
So back onto my non-Jewish identity, I went to Santa Clara University, which is a Catholic university. And I always say this is one of those things about being, no offense to 18-year-olds, but being 18 is there were two important things to me when I was 18. One is it was just after 9/11, to date myself, and I wanted to be somewhere where if something happened, I could get home in a day. So that was, kind of a big impact for me. And second was I wanted a Division I basketball program that I could work with. I wasn't good enough to play, and I knew that, but I wanted to manage a team. And Santa Clara offered me a small enough school that it was Division I, but also I had the likelihood of working with the team. And so I did for 4 years. I worked with it and actually saw one of the players that I worked with actually ended up here in Israel.
Wow.
Randomly enough. Deron Perkins ended up playing for Maccabi Tel Aviv and was a coach for Maccabi Tel Aviv. So talk about small worlds. He was a kid from Alaska that ended up playing here. So it really was a great experience for me. Very small school. We can talk about it later, how much it really impacted my Judaism to be at a Catholic school, and then, kind of the question of who I wanted to be. And then after that, after I graduated, I studied abroad here in Israel in Beersheba at Ben Gurion University while I was at Santa Clara. And then when I graduated, I got my graduate degree at the University of Southern California and I got my master's there.
Wow. A lot of college experience. And we'll definitely go into that topic of your Jewish identity in a bit. And I think that was a very great, concise overview. Next question that I have for you, aside from schmoozing time, this podcast, what is your favorite podcast to listen to? I know you're an avid podcaster, so if you could pick, one podcast or maybe even a few to just kind of talk about that.
I'd have to say that picking one would probably be very difficult. I would say the Promise podcast is probably my most avidly listened to. It's a weekly podcast about news here in Israel.
Okay.
And I like it because if you haven't listened to it, I recommend it. But basically, it's a semi-liberal view that brings on different people from Haaretz. There's Palestinian American views. And I find that it really challenges my point of view about what's going on here in Israel, while also in a way that I'm not like negative about, right? So I don't always agree with what they say, but I'm thinking about it while they're doing it. And they do it in what I think is a really interesting, bringing on very like cultural things, right? What's happening with the Eurovision and how does that impact what we see ourselves as Israelis? And so I've been really enjoying that podcast. I also, as a history buff, things about The Real Dictators, which is about different dictators in history. And again, I say this, and you say I know everything about history, but learning about different dictators in ways that like we've gone to Hitler forever and ever and ever, but different dictators in Africa, how much do I really know about Idi Amin? How much do I really know about, the ones in Asia, for instance? And so really getting to deep dive into how they have impacted their societies has been interesting for me. So I recommend that. And for short versions, Israel Story, just for short blurbs about what life means to be here in Israel, English speakers, I think is a great podcast. So I got a whole list. I'm sure we can do it on Instagram or Facebook later, but those are my top 3, I would say.
Awesome. And is the Israel Story, is that Times of Israel, or is that something separate?
It's something separate, although I think he does post sometimes. I'm blanking on the guy's name, but we can look for it later. But he basically interviews different people. Originally, it was different themes, and recently, since the war, he's just done 10-minute shorts about different individuals' impacts on the war. So everything from what does it mean to be the wife of someone serving in reserve duty? What does it mean to be, someone whose farm was destroyed on October 7th? Just all these little tiny stories that we don't think about the large impact, right? And so just how it impacted people in so many different ways.
Okay. Wow. Awesome. A lot of podcast recommendations. So if you guys have any free time to listen to other podcasts, definitely hit up that list. And
after this
yes,
one.
exactly. See, Lisa's smart. All right. Final question for you in your sort of Jewish geography profile. What is your favorite word that Israelis continue to mispronounce? What is your favorite English word that Israelis continue to mispronounce?
So the one I always make fun of my husband for is thistle, like in the rose, a thistle. That is impossible for Israelis to pronounce. I don't use it in my daily sentences, but it's the first one that always comes out. The one I would say that I use mostly with my kids and stuff was sloth. And my kids and I had a whole conversation about what a sloth is, and so those are my words.
Okay. Those are I feel like those are two very unique words, I would say. I think a very common answer that I get from people is the word hello. And I don't think people really realize it until you're in Israel. Like people will answer the phone, and my relatives will do the same thing. They'll go, I know. It's like a mix of Alan and hello. It's great. I love to hear it, but it's, you're mispronouncing the word hello.
I don't know if you've ever gone down this rabbit hole, but there's a couple Israeli companies that have named themselves off of Israeli mispronunciations of things. So my favorite is There For You, which is what you said, the flower wreaths and stuff. So it's There For You, but it's There For You.
That's funny. I like that one. Israelis are a funny group of people, and the mix between the American culture and the Israeli culture, when you have those two coming together, it's so fun to look at the differences and look at the similarities, and which is why Alexander Muss, and we'll get into this later, is an amazing program. You haven't heard about it, if you're past the high school age, I'm sure there's programs out there for you, but if you are in high school right now, highly recommend looking at this program. And again, I will tell you this later as we get into the episode. So Lisa, let's talk about your Jewish identity a little bit and how it kind of transformed. So as you mentioned, you went to a private Catholic high school, and I would say in your early teens, you weren't as observant, yet you made Aliyah to Israel and now are a practicing Jew. So what changed for you in terms of your Jewish identity?
So I'll clarify. I went to a private, non-religious high school, but a private
non-religious,
university.
Got it.
But my path's a little complicated. My dad's not Jewish. My mom is. My dad is. He was raised in a Greek Orthodox family, but he himself is not particularly religious. But what it meant is that I grew up with four grandparents who all had different degrees of what it meant to be religious and different religions. And as a child, on the one hand, it was really, I learned a lot. I went to synagogue. I went to Hebrew school, conservative Californian, which is kind of reform in a lot of different communities. And I had a bat mitzvah, which was, I read from the Torah, my bat mitzvah. But it didn't really mean anything to me particularly. It was, what my family did, and I showed up and I enjoyed it, but it wasn't particularly anything like I desired to do. Until when I was in high school, I first started thinking kind of, what my future was going to be. And, it was the first time, it was, again, to date myself a little bit, it was at the beginning of the Second Intifada. So, I didn't, again, really know much about world news, but I had a teacher when I was in high school who actually required us to read the news every day, current events, because we just had to read the front page of the news every day. And that's something I actually still do
Yep.
this day, right? It's
Yep.
6 in my head. So, that was when I really started thinking about, like, all this news is about Israel, the Sbarro pizza bombing, all these major events that happened. And what does that mean, right? When people say, the Jews deserve it, or, all these things that were happening. So I started learning, and then I chose, as I said, to go to a Catholic university. And I chose it for reasons having nothing to do with my Judaism or my image of myself, and simply, what I wanted to do with my life, kind of. And the story I always tell is one of my first days there, we had to meet with an advisor, and all the advisors were priests because it's a Catholic university. And I sat down, and he said, why are you here? And I was like, basketball and Latin. I don't know why else I'm here. And he looked at me in the eye and said, no, but why are you Jewish in here? And I was like, no one's ever asked me that. Like, what do you mean, why am I Jewish in here? Like, I'm here. It doesn't matter that I'm Jewish or not. And it was something that he kept poking me at, right? Like, why would anyone Jewish do this? And I know it's stupid maybe, but I hadn't thought about it, right? Like, it wasn't that important to me. So that really got me thinking of, well, why am I Jewish in here, right? What does it mean to go to a Catholic university? And then my second story is that we had to take a religion class our first year. And the two options were religions of the book or Jesus and marriage. And I thought, Jesus and marriage is too Catholic even for me. That seems a bit much. But religions of the book, Christianity, Islam, I can do that. That's, pretty basic. And we were sitting in class, and we were doing Leviticus about the laws and about kashrut. And the teacher said something, about the kashrut, and the kids raised their hand and said, but these rules seem really arcane. Why do we have to learn them? And the teacher said, well, no one actually does this anymore. We're doing it for the history of it. And I said, I don't think that's true. I didn't keep coaching at the time, right? But I was like, this doesn't feel right to me. And the teacher pulled, as any good teacher does, why don't you go study and come back to me? So I did. I started studying. And when I went to study abroad, I spent a couple months in Greece and then a couple months in Israel. And to me, that was my real time to say, what does this mean to me, right? What does it mean to live in a Jewish state? What does it mean to live in other than Greece, which is a very Christian, Greek Orthodox community? And it's really where I started thinking about what does it mean to me? And I discovered more and more that this might sound funny, but I like having boundaries and borders. I think it makes me a better person to think about what I eat and what I do. And, it's funny. I was just looking, Sarah Michelle Gellar. I don't know if you follow her on Instagram or any social media, or if you know who she is. Maybe I'm dating myself on that too, but Empire Slayer. And she had posted of non social media day, right? Turning off all electronics. And I was like, that's Shabbat, right? There's this important thing. And I'm not saying you have to keep Shabbat all the time, but to me, turning off all my things for a day and focusing on my family and my friends and having conversations, it makes me a better person, right? And so those were things that in college I started thinking about and again, I was in college at a time when social media was not what it is today. It was much less than it is today. But even then, like, how do I want my family to grow? And what do I want my friendships to be like? And, what do I want? What kind of people do I want my friends to be? And again, I'm not saying that Jews are better, just that I want a thought process there. I want to feel like I'm connecting to people in a way that's not, just superficial. And so it really took me into that next step of, thinking about how I dress, thinking about what I say, thinking about what I'm learning, thinking about my history. To me, history has always been important. And, I I love, and you've seen this part of me is standing here in Israel and being able to point around to thousands of years of history, right? When we're at Tel Gezer picking up a piece of rock, I know it sounds really like maybe silly, but like holding a piece of pottery that someone made in this spot thousands of years ago, to me is just like an astounding piece of being able to do that. Like I am blessed and lucky. So
Right.
that's what
Wow.
we got
Wow.
here.
Wow. I think your transformation of going from, you know, attending a private Catholic university to now becoming the Dean of Israel Studies at, the best study abroad program in Israel. I'm going to keep saying that because it's 100% true. Like, I'd love the MHSI, it changed my life. But I think this kind of proves the point of, you have to try different things out, and knowing what you don't like or what you are is as important as knowing what you are actually as a person. And I think that's really cool that you kind of went from literally the polar opposite of what you are now and transform your life. And in Judaism, we call that, being off the derech. And I don't like that term because it's saying that we kind of have like this path that we must follow. And, Judaism can't be done in a multitude of different ways. But, that's a whole other topic. But I want to touch on, Shabbat and, being sneas, or as what we call it in Yiddish, and wearing long skirts and dressing modestly, and keeping kosher. I think a lot of people, including myself, struggle with the fact that, like, as Jews, when we follow these laws, we're restricting ourselves, right? And you're kind of talking about having boundaries for yourself is something that's good because it keeps you, I would say, disciplined, and it keeps you like in the right mind. So kind of talk about, why do you, Lisa, continue to practice the laws of kashrut, the laws of Shabbat, and all these other Jewish laws, even though they're so restrictive? What is the significance behind, being a practicing, religious, observant Jew?
So I'll start by saying I do strongly feel there's a different path for everybody. And, anyone who's watching, I don't cover my hair. I wear certain pants when I run. I'm not against it per se, but I always talk about this with my students, and maybe you remember it from when you were here, but how you dress impacts people, for better or
Right.
worse, right?
Mm-hmm.
And people will make judgments based on how you're dressed. Now, I always say, even when I first started teaching, I was 20 years old when I started teaching, and I was in a classroom with 18-year-old seniors. I knew that I needed to dress in a way that made me separate. I'm a teacher, right? I have respect for my position. I have respect for who I am, and I am in a position of power and authority, for lack of a better term. It is the best term there is. And therefore, I want to dress that way, right? I want to dress in a way that shows that I respect my job, and I respect my position. I respect my students. And, one of my biggest pet peeves is not actually see it, but like kids who show up in pajamas, like, just show me like you've gotten up for the day, right? That you've taken a second to think about, what you're wearing into class, right? That's
Right.
honestly a bigger issue for me.
Right.
And same thing with things like kashrut. I didn't grow up keeping kosher. I miss cheeseburgers. That's probably about the only thing I miss.
Wow.
But I think I will say, if anyone, as a non-plug, it's not a paid plug, but go to Crave in Jerusalem. It's the best
Oh,
burger
yes.
that people ever have.
Yes. Crave in Jerusalem is, sorry to go off on this tangent, but Crave in Jerusalem, amazing cheeseburgers. Also, there's this place in Tel Aviv, and I think there's other locations I think it's called Bodega. They have kosher bacon cheeseburgers. Unreal. Like amazing, amazing. I can only imagine that they're pretty close to what an actual
As someone
cheeseburger
who's
tastes
eaten
like.
both, yes, they absolutely are.
Wow. Okay. Okay.
Besides that tangent. So, it's, for me, it's about thinking about what I'm eating, and taking that step. Same thing about, praying in the morning. I pray every morning, and I'm not necessarily good at praying the rest of the day, but for me, starting off, it's my meditation, right? I want to start the day off in a way where my mindset says, I've thought about the day. I've thought about thanking God for everything I have, and for focusing my mind on what I want the day to look like and what I want out of myself for that day. And for me, it's that important bit. Now, different people have different ways of doing it, but for me, the traditional Shacharit prayer is how I do it. And the same thing with Shabbat. Again, it's about separating for my family, right? I rush all week. I'm sure you remember what this work is like. We invest everything in our students, and we're traveling all week. And so for me to say, these 25 hours are me and my kids and my husband and my in-laws and even my friends who live across the street, right? This is our time to debrief and talk about the rest of the week and how we feel and what we think. I just think in general, we don't give enough time to that in today's day and age, right? We're so stuck on our phone, and this is me on my high horse. We're so focused on what social media says and we're scrolling and we're not paying attention that it is so hard. I mean, I don't know if you've been following this. I've been following it deeply about schools right now, about high schools, about taking kids' phones away and like the reactions kids have been having. And I think we just need to do it again, not all the time, but an hour, 2 hours. Like, what happens when you just do that and see what happens a little bit?
For real, I think your point about phones and how much they can actually take away from the world and how you're perceiving reality is it's actually astronomical. And I think Shabbat is a great way and a great medium for people to just say, like, you know what, 25 hours, I'm not going to touch my phone. It's probably the hardest thing that you can do now. And quite frankly, one of the reasons, like, I don't do it now, like, I don't keep Shabbat now, is because I'm in college for 4 years and I only have 4 years of college. Like, after then, that's a conversation for later. But I think really phones take away from the world so much. And, it's definitely a very, very big issue, to the point where I think my generation doesn't know how to interact with people outside of social media. And that's an even bigger issue in itself, because again, you're getting into the whole jobs thing and having an interview with somebody face to face, which is why, one of the reasons why I'm doing this podcast, also for the personal branding and for the Jewish aspect, is because I get to practice my communication skills and talking to somebody face to face and having a conversation. Even though it's like, it's virtual, still I'm having a face to face conversation.
I want to say not all or nothing, right? If you put your phone down for an hour, even us now having this conversation for an
Right.
hour, right? Whatever it is, and just having that specific time set aside and say, I'm going to focus on this person in my life makes such a difference.
Right. No, I 100% agree with you. Like, it is so important. And I think this also goes back to kind of like, we're going off on a big tangent here, but it goes back to like how families are, perceive or I guess giving their kids phones, right? Like, for instance, like, my parents didn't give me a phone until I was in like 6th or 7th grade, because, first of all, I didn't need one, but then also, like, a phone is not like necessarily a privilege. It's not a privilege. Like, it's something that that's earned. So I think my parents did a good job of like introducing that to me. And also with the help of keeping Shabbat as a kid, like, I had that time where like I just didn't go on my phone. But obviously now times have changed. And like you said, like, social media is really kind of sucking kids up and they're not really experiencing reality. And it's a really, really big problem. Like, I don't know how future generations are going to deal with it and what the impact of it is, but it definitely is I don't know if I would classify it as scary, but it's like definitely a very, very big change.
I'll tell you, my own kids, my eldest, don't laugh yet. My oldest is 14 now, so she's a ninth grader, and so they got phones when they were relatively young.
Right.
Mostly because of security in Israel, they were traveling on public buses already at a young age. It's very different here, but none of them have. They have WhatsApp, because in Israel that's like mandatory for schools. It's how their teachers communicate with them. But beyond that, they don't have Instagram. They don't have Facebook. They don't have Twitter. None of that. Snapchat. I have lots of personal feelings about Snapchat. It's a whole different conversation. And I will say, one of the things in my job is we see the worst of the worst, right? We've had, and I won't go into it here, but we have so many stories about bullying and, issues on Snapchat, specifically on Snapchat, but also Instagram, and how, kids think that their things are so secret.
Mm-hmm.
They're not. It's public, it doesn't go away. So I've been I don't want to say I've been strict with my kids, because now that my eldest is almost 15, we've been having conversations about what does she want? And she doesn't want it for now, because she sees what it does to her friends. And I'll be honest, she's been having some issues with her friends, and anorexia and bulimia and different body image issues. And like, it is difficult to be a kid, especially a girl, in these age when you're surrounded by these constant images. So for me, that's something that we talk about a lot, and it's scary. Like, I want her to disconnect a little bit and just exist.
Okay, so I want to go onto the topic of kind of disconnecting. And I'm not talking about phones, but I'm talking about where you, Lisa, live in Israel. I think a lot of people perceive Israel or people from Israel only to live in two places, those being Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, right? Because those are obviously biggest two cities. But Lisa lives in a town called Kiryat Gat, which is located in southern Israel in the Negev. So, Lisa, first of all, why don't you tell us why you decided to kind of disconnect from quote unquote typical Israeli culture, and also just kind of talk about the advantages and disadvantages of living in the Negev.
So we ended up in Kiryat Gat because my husband's actually from there. So that's,
Okay.
the main focus. But one of the main things when I moved here was, and this is going to come off a little high horsey maybe, but I didn't want to live in an Anglo bubble. I said, if I'm going to move to Israel, then I want my kids to be Israeli. I want them to speak Hebrew. I want them to, exist. I want them to think about the army. I want them to, have the Israeli experience. And for me, the people that I've met who live in Tel Aviv or in Renana or in Jerusalem, some of them do, but it takes a lot of effort, right? Because their kids speak English in school and have American friends and live in a kind of specific bubble. So for me, it was important that my kids, and for better or worse, my kids are Israeli first and American second, and their Hebrew is better than their English, although, their English is good. The hard part is that up until about 5 years ago, there were 3 English speakers in the whole city, which meant that, my friends were Israeli, and it's different when your friends have a different native language than you, right? It takes time to think about what you want to say, and then I sound like a first grader sometimes in Hebrew, and one of the workers here was correcting my Hebrew the other day, and I was like, I know it's wrong. I don't want to think about it anymore, right? The grammar, male, female, and, plural, past, and all that stuff. So, I will say what I love about Kiryat Gat is it's a community. This isn't a big city. I don't like big cities. I'm not a city person. I wasn't a city person when I was in the States. I know Stanford maybe sounds like a city, but really it's a whole bunch of suburbs. It's very, American kind of, not like out in the boonies, but, not big city. But I didn't want that. And what I also appreciate about Israel, that even when you're not in a city, everything is still walkable. So on the one hand, you have the benefit of having a small community. On the other hand, there's a grocery store and a bakery right across the street from us. My kids go to dance class right across the street. They take, again, public buses to school and to scouts and to these things. So it's much smaller in a lot of senses, even though it's not a city. And then I always appreciated that balance of it. I wonder sometimes, would it be better in a place with more Americans? My kids feel a little more not different. I mean, they're kind of known as the Americans, and I actually just had a conversation where they introduced me to a group of 8th graders that's going to Chicago to study to exchange program. And they introduced me as a Reform rabbi. And I was like, I'm not a Reform. That's not who I am in any way, shape, or form, in so many different ways. But to an Israeli, that's like, they don't know what to do with me, right? They're like, you're in Kiryat Gat, but you're religious, but you don't cover your hair, but, wear pants sometimes. And to them, that's such a confusing concept, right? As in Kiryat Gat, it's very traditional, right? You're Orthodox or you're not. And so, it's been interesting to find that balance. And we opened up our first egalitarian synagogue. So that's for our big movement. And now there's about 100 American families, and we have a book club. And so things are growing and changing, but we like it. It's a smaller community.
Right. And what's the population of Kiryat Gat?
So it was about 60,000, which I would say is a small city. Right now it's somewhere probably about 70,000. Again, it's been growing rather rapidly. We also have 2 communities after October 7th that have moved into our community. Nir Oz has moved in. So numbers are a little bit in flux, but 75,000 is probably where we sit right now.
Got it. Very nice. And I think it's very important to your listeners who are well-versed in Israel, not well-versed in Israel, to hear from people that live outside of, the big cities of Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and, because those are the cities that get the most media, and obviously, those are the cities that are going to have the best nightlife. Like, you're going to find everybody there. Like, that.
Kiryat Gat is nightlife.
Okay. So note to self, don't go to Kiryat Gat to party, guys. Like, not the place. But if you want to go visit Lisa, you could go to Kiryat Gat to do that.
And you know what? If you want a quieter town, there's actually, I don't know, I'm sure you've heard of Masa has a teacher program where you spend 6 months in Tel Aviv and then 6 months somewhere else. And we are the somewhere else for some kids. And I've been talking to some of these kids, actually, some of them are HSI alum who have come back. And they were saying after, a couple months in Tel Aviv, some of them kind of like the, slower pace and the more family style, bigger holidays, that kind of stuff. So, not everyone needs a big nightlife.
Right, right. And I think to that point, Tel Aviv, I think the best word to describe it would be balagan, because it is moving all the time. And, there's people, I think one of the biggest culture shocks to me was that people in Tel Aviv will drive their motorcycles on the sidewalks. And I was like, what the hell? Like, these people are crazy. Like, it's just like, it's something out of a movie that you see. Like, you're walking on the sidewalk to go to the beach, and then all of a sudden, vroom, like, just like, what? People are crazy there. But I love it. I love it.
And one thing I'll say about like where I am, I'm a female runner and I run at night and I have never once felt unsafe by myself,
Mhm.
running out. People are, I don't say we're very active. People walk all the time around the city. It's like just a thing. It's kind of like Europe where people like sit outside on their front porch all the time, right? It's just much more of a community, right? You know your neighbors and people there to
Exactly,
support you.
exactly. So now let's move about, I would say, an hour south or hour north to a suburb just outside of Tel Aviv called Hod HaSharon, which is where MHSI, Alexander Muss High School in Israel, is located. So, Lisa, why don't you tell our listeners what Alexander Muss High School in Israel is, just so that they don't hear from me, who's a extremely biased AMHSI fanboy. What is
I'm not biased.
no, I feel like you are biased, but like not as much. What is Alexander Muss High School in Israel, and just talk about what its mission and goals are.
So Alexander Muss High School in Israel has been around for more than 50 years. 1972 was our very first program. And we are a study abroad program for mostly American high school students, mostly high school students. Basically, we run programs from 5 weeks to 4 months. We did an 8-week program, which are mini semester programs. And kids come here and they learn everything we say from Bereshit ad Akshav. So from the very, very beginning of Jewish history until today. And amongst that, if you're doing an academic program like you did, there's general studies, so you can keep up with your science and your math and your history, whatever you have to back home. In our summer programs, it is more focused. So we have, for instance, a new summer program about entrepreneurship, or a program that is a non-academic version of our academic program. So in our academic program, you can get college credit. In our non-academic program, you can't. Maybe you get volunteer hours if that's something that's important, for high school students out there. And we do work with day schools like Barrick and Milken, Charles E. Smith day schools coming out to us this week, actually, 2 days.
Oh, wow.
So, honestly, I think we have the best job. Our main focus is, kids like you, both kids who are affiliated, but also not affiliated, kids who are questioning, what their Jewish past and future means and is, kids who think that none of this means anything to them, but their parents or grandparents do. And we want to, convince them that it also means something to them. And I think what I always say is most important is that we want to, same thing I was saying back before, we want to challenge students, right? The same thing, I think you said it great about knowing who we aren't. It's just important as knowing who we are. And that's, we want you guys to question that of, the difficult question, what does it mean to intermarry? And I'm not saying it's good or bad, but what does it mean to you, right? If you look at your future, is that something that you see or not, right? What does it mean for your day-to-day practice, right? If you have a red line that says, looking after October 7th, this to me is anti-Semitism. This to me is part of natural discourse, right? And to figure out where those lines are, you have to have the discussion before you can understand what you think. And that's what we do. And we take kids to Poland and we do Yam Yam and we challenge them on hikes. They have to put down their phone sometimes. It's really difficult. But, I was just talking about this. They did 2 hikes. They did a hike in the desert called Snevir Gadol, and then they went down and did Hartz V'Hut, where you see 4 countries. You see Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Jordan and Israel all from one tatzvi, from one lookout point. And, some of the parents saying, oh, it's so challenging. Yes. You know what? It's good to push yourself past that limit. And you may come back to me and you may say, I hated every second. I'm never doing that again. And that is justified and you do you. Or I think like a lot of kids come back and say, wow, I accomplished that. And I am so proud. I didn't think I could, right? And I did.
Mhm.
And I have the best pictures to prove it. And, and I say this as someone who, honestly, when I was your age, I hated hiking and I thought it was terrible. And now I take
Wow.
my kids hiking and drag them hiking all the time. You never know until you challenge yourself. And that's really what we do here at Alexander Muss is try to push those boundaries and question. And I think for a lot of high school students, especially, American education tends to be very boxed in. And how can we show you different ways of thinking about things? And how can we show you, what being in the field means and what Israeli education means and what life after October 7th means and all these different things.
The biggest takeaway from what Lisa was saying is challenging. Like that's the essence of Alexander Muss High School in Israel. And I wholeheartedly agree with that. I remember the instant we got there, like the first time we got off the bus, like it was, we were all jet lagged, we were all tired. And I don't remember exactly who it was, but somebody was like, listen, guys, I know you're tired. Like, I know you're jet lagged, totally normal. However, we simply don't care. You are going to class tomorrow morning at, 9 a.m. and you are going to stick out the entire day. I mean, that is challenging, right? Another thing that I think was really challenging and going back to your hike is that when Alexander Moss, and I think this is the best part about it, is you learn outside of the classroom in addition to learning in the classroom, right? So we would learn about, for example, Masada, right? We do a unit on Masada and, about zealots and whatever, and we talk about that. And then the next day, we'd go to Masada, we'd hike it, and we'd be on top of Masada learning more about Masada. It was just the coolest thing. And we don't take the birthright path, as they like to call it. We don't go up the back way. No. Like Lisa, when my trip, I remember we had to wake up, I think it was like 4 or 5 a.m. We were all just so groggy and tired and whatever. And Lisa's just like, guys, you ready to climb Masada? Like she's so energetic, like ready to go. And we're all like, yeah, Lisa, like we're ready. We're climbing Masada. And I remember climbing Masada with everybody. It took us like, I think it was like 30, 45 minutes. I don't know exactly how long. And I mean, like at the time, like I was in decent shape, nothing crazy, but I remember getting to the top of Masada. And I climbed Masada once before. And I remember getting to the top of Masada and I felt like I was gonna pass out. It was so challenging, but at the end of the day, it's so rewarding to, go out on these trips and see all these really cool things. And, it's just the only program that you can really actually immerse yourself in Israeli culture, in, Jewish history and learn that way. And I myself, I'm not a classroom guy. Like I like to sit here and schmooze and see people and talk to people and do whatever. So like this program was perfect for me in the sense that like I not only have made great relationships with other people in my cohort who I still talk to this day and who I consider to be very, very close friends, but I also learned the proper Israeli history that you don't get at like any Jewish private school. No offense to other Jewish private schools, but you can't teach Israeli history without actually being in Israel and seeing it. It is an amazing, amazing program.
So we always talk about that a lot, when we talk about especially modern history and you talk about the wall, right? And I think
Right.
people have this image of what it looks like. And then you stand in Jerusalem and you look over Gilo and you look at what the wall actually looks like and what it looks like to live there. It changes it, right? It changes the way you think. And I think one thing people always ask me is, first of all, are we a religious school? We are a non-denominational pluralistic school, which we can discuss what that means in a whole different podcast. But, my main goal is not to push religion on any kid, but again, to introduce them to different religions or different, like if you've never experienced a Karlbach minion, you've never experienced a Karlbach minion, right? If you've never experienced a conservative minion at Keturah, you've never experienced that. And just to
Right.
know what's out there, to know what you like and don't like is so important. And second is, people saying, well, you pro-Israel. We're a school in Israel. That is what it is. We are pro-Israel. But that doesn't mean we're pushing any sort of specific narrative of what that means.
Mhm.
I'm not saying
Yeah.
you can't be anti-Israeli government. I'm not saying you can't be anti what the government has done or have issues with the hostages or the war or any of that. but be specific about what you mean, right? When you say, Netanyahu is X, why? Why are you saying that? And what does it mean, right? When you say
Right.
ceasefire now, what does that practically mean for you and the people who live here? And that's all we're asking, is that students, question that and think about that and come out with a better understanding of what they believe.
hmm No, I 100% agree with you. And as somebody that really didn't understand and grasp the concept of Zionism before I went to Alexander Muss High School, like to be honest, like I wouldn't say that I was a Zionist prior to attending Alexander Muss High School. And I wouldn't even say that like Alexander must push this, Zionist agenda on us, right? A lot of what we learned about was factual history. It wasn't like, Lisa staying up there saying like, oh, you have to, follow, like stand with us on social media no, it was absolutely none of that. It was Lisa talking to us about Israeli history, and we formed our own opinions based off that. And I even remember, and I think this was one of like my biggest takeaways from Alexander Muss, is we actually visited a Israeli Palestinian, or it was either Israeli Arab or Israeli Palestinian village in Jerusalem. And we got to go to a mosque for like, this was the first time I'd ever been in a mosque, right? You think of all programs, right? I live in America where there's a lot of Muslims here, and there's a lot of opportunities for me to attend a mosque here. Of all places in the world that I would go to a mosque, right? It'd be Israel. That was the first time I ever went to a mosque. And, we sat down with this very nice woman who invited us into her home. We got to talk to, I remember the kid's name. His name was Muhammad. I think we were talking about like sports or something. And it was just an amazing, amazing experience. It was the first time that I got to talk to a Palestinian that was my age that didn't like, again, my entire life, I didn't know a single Palestinian. I was only, I had at home, obviously, I was biased to this one view of like what Palestinians are. And this was the first time that I got to actually see for myself that like, okay, like maybe like this narrative that like Israelis and Palestinians can come together and coexist is actually possible, right? And I think it was an amazing experience for me, especially because my family's from the Arab world. Like my grandfather, as I've said many times, grew up in Syria. My grandmother came from Lebanon. So I've always had an appreciation for, Arab culture and stuff like that. So it was really the first time where I got to like see that. And that was just amazing, amazing.
In a fun randomness, our spring semester is actually meeting her tomorrow. So they're going
Oh,
to Enram, name is Yasmin.
there we
So they're
go.
actually getting part of that experience
There
tomorrow.
we go. Wow. What a coincidence. Lisa, I want to tell another story about Alexander Muss, because again, the stories of Muss that like I have in my recollection are just amazing. And I've been to Israel, I think 4 times now, very fortunate. And I always say that Alexander Muss was, and I think this is going to stand true, was and is going to be my favorite trip ever, just because of how much I learned, the connections, the stories. But one story in particular I want to touch on is last day of Alexander Muss. I think one of the most like powerful, like God actually exists things happened to me. And Lisa, you're going to do a better job of telling it than I am. So I want to give a brief intro. So we're at, um, we're at Har Herzl, right? And we're the last day. Me and my friends are all so depressed. Like okay, I'm gonna be a little bit vulnerable here. Like I don't cry. Like I'm not a big crier, but like last day of Muss, I was bawling my eyes out, like crazy. Like I was like, I don't want to leave. Like this is the best two weeks of my life, like or 2 months of my life. I don't want to leave. So we're standing there. We're all just like, God, do we have to do this, Lisa? Like, come on, like we just want to go back and like party and like whatever. Like we want to just like hang out with each other. Okay, Lisa, I'm gonna let you take over from here. So why don't you tell a story? We're at Har Herzl at this gravesite. Last day, we're all depressed. Yeah.
We're all depressed. And I could put up a picture. So maybe on Instagram or somewhere you can add the picture of our group on this last day for proof. So I'll backstory it a little bit in the fact that my grandfather had died just the day before, and I I was myself was very depressed for.
I forgot to add that detail. Very important detail.
I don't know if you guys knew at the time. I had a very hard couple days, and so I had said that morning. It was also Tu B'Shvat. I said I'm going to do everything in his memory, and I'm going to do it. He loved Israel and everything about Israel, and if we talk about path and brand, he was a huge part of shaping who I am and who I was. So we get to our Herzl, and I had called my brother-in-law. My brother-in-law, his name is Ami Biton. If anyone wants to Google him, he is currently the head of Tzanchanim. He's fighting in Gaza right now. And back then, he was the head of Duvdevan, of this unit in the troopers, and he had lost a soldier about 6 months before, whose name was Ronen Lubarsky. And in an operation in Ramallah, he had a concrete block dropped on his head. And I called my brother-in-law and I said, do you want me to do anything, to say anything? My brother-in-law is not particularly I don't know if not an emotional person, probably not the right word, but, he's not particularly someone who would ask for anything. So he said, if you could go and you could talk about him and have a moment of silence, that'd be important to me. And I said, sure, of course. So I brought your group up there, and it was kind of the last thing we did after we did all of Mount Herzl, learning about all these different people. And so I was telling you about Ronen Lubarsky, that he was, in early 20s. He was a writer. He was a runner. He was kind of, not the guy you picked to be in an elite unit like that. He was kind of smaller, quieter. And as we're speaking, this guy comes up, and it happens a lot. People they love free tours. If people think you're giving a tour, they want to come and they want to listen and they want it for free. So I ignored him as we were speaking because I'm focused on you guys. And I told about this guy and, the story. And as we finished, I said, again, can we have a moment of silence? And everyone, had a moment of silence. And at the end, this guy says, do you mind if I say something? Like, okay, I don't know who you are, but sure. And he said, I'm Ronen's father. Now, Ronen, they're from Rehovot, lives nowhere near Jerusalem. And I didn't quite know what to say because, not that my brother-in-law was responsible for his death. He wasn't in any way, but he was the commander in charge, right? So you never quite know how families are going to take things, So I said something like, we're glad you're welcome to say whatever you want. Just so you know, my brother-in-law is Ami Biton. He was Biton's commander. And the guy says, Ami Biton, Ami Biton? And I was like, yeah. And he just started crying. I started crying. And he said, you don't know, but Ami Biton is the only reason why I survived the days of mourning. He said, he showed up at my house all the day. He brought his unit. He talked about my son, and he gave me stories, and he gave me strength, and he still calls me on the phone. And I say this a lot of it. It's term in Judaism called hashgacha practice, right? That we see God's hand in moments. And I'm not a particularly spiritual person in a lot of ways, but I told myself if I had to be anywhere in the world, and I wasn't at my grandfather's funeral because that was happening in California, but I was here giving this man, again, I could never give him solace because he lost his son, but all of you had heard his son's story and had taken a little bit of his son's flame and life and passion, and he could see that his son's story was being told. And again, no offense, this random group of American kids who was learning about his son and taking that on with them.
Right.
That I'm in the right place and we're on the right place. And but after, I asked the Madafim to kind of take you guys away. And, I said, I just need a minute. And I don't remember who it was Ryan, or maybe it was the other day, but someone came up to me after and was like, you planned that, didn't you? And I was like, no, I swear I didn't plan that. That was totally by happenstance. And honestly, I've been back there a dozen times since. It's never happened again. I've never seen that again. But, I always say, when we go to places like Mount Herzl, or when I've gone to funerals since then, especially in the last couple of months, I always say we're here to tell their stories. To these people were individuals. They had lives and families and passions, and to be able to give that over to my students and to people who've come here and to say, this person, Ronen Lubarsky, is just a name on a stone. But look him up. He was a kid who had dreams and hopes, and they do these amazing things. They run in his honor from Rehovot to Jerusalem every year. They have raised charities in his name. They ran to orphanages, all these different amazing things. And every story that we talk about, I think especially, post October 7th, we think about just the pure numbers, but the stories, right? These were individuals who had lives, and I feel the same way. This is such a nerdy part of me, but about history, right? When I teach Herod the Great's awesome to learn about, but also what about all the people who lived under him, right? Who experienced Masada on Masada, right? Who lived these truths. in the same way that we're living a truth, right? And it's so easy to just think in these big broad strokes and these big famous people and the Donald Trumps of the world and these big names, but what about us, right? The people who
Right.
live every day, with passion and purpose. And we talk about branding. We see ourselves as individuals, and I want that to be an
Right.
important thing for my students, that you have a message, whatever that is, and people will listen. Again, maybe it's not the whole world. Maybe it is. Maybe it'll be the biggest podcast ever. But the point is that you're reaching people, and that's what matters, right? One person at a time.
Right. Wow. Wow. I can tell you, like, this was, I mean, Lisa did a phenomenal job of explaining the story, but it doesn't do justice unless you're like actually there. Like, I just remember, like, that was like one of the first times I was like, how is this like, that's literally a one in like a billion, maybe like trillion, like chance of happening. I mean, like, we're literally, just to summarize for some of you that maybe like lost track of the story, we're literally standing at this guy named Ronan's gravesite who had just died 6 months before, and his father shows up. Of all people, his father shows up, and his father was from far away from Jerusalem. Like, I want to say Rehoboth's probably like a good hour, 2 hours, depending on traffic, outside of Jerusalem. And it was like, what the hell? Like, why, of all people, of all days, like, why is it that like he's here in this time? And I think it was such a powerful moment. Looking back on it again, like in the moment, it was very powerful. But I think even looking back on it now, it strikes me even more that like God really works in mysterious ways. And there's all these like little blessings that come in disguise. And I think Lisa was mourning the death of her grandfather, and she obviously, flying to California from Israel is not easy at all. And she made the decision that she was going to stay with our group and continue to teach us, because it was our last couple of days, which I think just goes to show like how like humble and selfless she is, which is amazing. One of the other reasons why I think she's an amazing teacher. But I just think it's one of the stories that, like, when there's something that's like not going right in your life sometimes, and you know you're in a bad place, or you're in a place that like you don't physically, mentally want to be, like, sometimes like things just happen, and God's kind of just sending you a message like, hey, things are going to be okay.
And I think that's important. I think, I don't care if people are religious or not. I just think there's a moment of saying we are where we're supposed to be at any given time. And again, you can change it and you can think about the future, but embracing, and again, I know this kind of goes back to social media thing, embracing who we are and where we are at any given moment and saying, I'm going to do the best I can and see the miracles. I always joke when I go running, I hate running as much as I run, but part of my mantra is I am so blessed to be able to be uncomfortable right now. I'm so blessed to be able to put one foot in front of the other and say, I am running here in Israel every step. Like, I know that maybe sounds like, I don't even mean in a religious way, but I'm just so lucky to be able to do that. People can't, and I can. But just having those constant thoughts of like, I'm a lucky person and I'm proud of where I am.
Final question I have for you is, as a teacher, how do you build a personal brand? I mean, I believe a lot of people just don't fully understand the importance of having a personal brand, which is part of the reason why I created this podcast. However, you yourself have taken initiative to, be interviewed by the Times of Israel for an article, and hosting webinars for AMHSI during COVID, among many other things. Talk about your personal brand and why it's so important to you that you continue to build it.
So I'll say I have what I describe myself as like a low-key brand, in the sense that I'm never really one who, I don't see myself as building up a large empire or having, a dream of a large following necessarily. But I want to be true to myself and be able to share that with the world. So, I have an Instagram and I have my Facebook, and I do interviews and I do speaking tours, around the States and to different schools. And I think one thing I've heard, especially post October 7th, is people are always grateful to hear my personal story. And I don't mean that in a selfish way, but in the sense of someone who lives in the South as an American who grew up in a very different world from the one I chose, and the challenges, that I've overcome to get here, and the full-on conviction I have in what I do every day. And I want to sell that, right? I believe in it. And so for me, it's a very natural, it's a very natural progression, right? In the sense that I want to be authentically me, and that is my brand. So, if you want to follow Instagram, California and Israel, I have a lot of that. That's California and Israel is kind of my thing because that's how I see myself. I am, as much as I like to say it, I am a San Franciscan at heart, and I will always be a San Franciscan. There's not much you can do to get that out of somebody when you're born and raised in an area like San Francisco. But I am also highly impacted by being in Kiryat Gat for 15 years now, and this kind of, again, seeing those miracles and little things and facing the challenges head on. And I don't want my social media to be something sparkly and shiny and, with no problems. I want to be able to say life in Israel sucks sometimes, and October 7th was really difficult, but I'm still here and my kids are still here. And, this is why we've made that choice. And you may not agree with me and other people may not agree with me, but like, I'm open for discussion, but we've made our choice. And then I full-heartedly stand by who I am. So for me, that's all part of the branding, right? So it's, again, I don't have, large goals of politics or, wealth and stars. I'm a teacher in the end of all things, but I think we all can brand ourselves and again, stand behind who we are and the image we want to present to the world and, our convictions. And that's what's most important.
And if you guys have any questions for Lisa about like anything Israel related, I mean, she knows it all like the back of her hand. Like she said, like we learned, she knows everything from Bereshit up until literally today. She knows everything. So make sure you go follow Lisa. Also make sure you go follow Alexander Muss High School in Israel. And any of you are interested in the programs that they have, like feel free to DM at Schmoozing Time on Instagram. I'd be more than happy to give you an hour spiel on why it's the greatest program ever. And we want to thank Lisa for coming on today's episode. Until next time, keep schmoozing.